Oh, yoi, yoi.
Thank you all for joining us for this last roundtable of the day. I would like to briefly introduce its participants. Ian J. Miller is professor of history at Harvard, specialist of modern Japan, working in the field of environmental history, while also being the faculty dean of Cabot House with the responsibility for over 400 students. So thank you for leaving them for a few days and joining us. Okay. In his first book, The Nature of the Beasts, Empire and Exhibition at the Tokyo Imperial Zoo, he chose what at the time was a risky and little practiced approach, as he put human-animal relations in the forefront of his analysis of the history of colonial Japan through a study of the foundation of Tokyo's Ueno Zoo. His subsequent research further explored the relationship between Japan's history, culture, and physical environment. His collaborative co-edited volume, Japan at Nature's Edge, The Environmental Context of a Global Power, is considered a groundbreaking work in environmental history, as it grappled with the question of Japanese modernization by examining Japan's role in global environmental transformation. More recently, his research has focused on the links between environment and energy. In 2019, he was guest co-editor of the Forum on Energy Transition for the journal Environmental History. And so we are very fortunate to have Professor Miller here with us today to help us rethink the origin of Japan's modern environmental history. We are also very pleased to welcome Wakana Suzuki, who is senior lecturer at the Graduate School of Human Science at Osaka University and a visiting scholar at the University of Amsterdam. Her research links anthropology to the history of science and technology in a multi-scalar approach, as she articulates the relationships of human to microbes, humans to humans, and humans to the world they live in. She has published extensively in academic journals, such as the Japan Journal for Science, Technology, and Society, Nature Culture, or Current Anthropology. And she has taken part in collaborative volumes, most notably a chapter in the 2020 edited volume, Views of Science and Technology Studies, as well as an entry in the International Encyclopedia of Anthropology. Today, her presentation will focus on not only what we eat, but how we make it, the case of fermented food. On top of being our host for this conference, when she's not organizing symposia, Aleksandra Kobiljski is a research associate professor at CNRS. Her research focuses on the history of technology and innovation in Japan, and most recently she has worked on the manufacturing of raw materials and the nuts and bolts of the Tokugawa Meiji transition and Japan's early industry. In doing so, she brings environment to history of technology and labors to bridge the Edo-Meiji divide. She is published in History and Technology, or the Revue d'Histoire Moderne et Contemporaine, and acted as editor of the journal Technology and Culture. Her publications also include chapters in the collective volumes Science, Technology, and Medicine in the Modern Japanese Empire, and Les Techniques et la Globalisation au XXe siècle. She also co-edited the book Histoire des techniques, Monde, Société et Culture. She is the principal investigator of an ERC project called J Innovatech, which critically investigates our current approaches to innovation. Today, she will be discussing our new global industrial now. And finally, we're extremely fortunate to welcome Wolf Feuerhahn, research professor at CNRS, co-editor of the journal Revue d'Histoire des Sciences Humaines, and CNRS bronze medalist in 2017. He is a historian of science with a special focus on the history of science and knowledge, and more particularly on how knowledge, sciences, and disciplines were organized, named, and labeled in the French, English, and German-speaking world. Professor Feuerhahn has published numerous articles and co-edited a number of special issues. In the last 5 years, he has authored, co-authored, and edited several volumes. Arpenter l'histoire des sciences, témoignages de chercheurs français contemporains. Éditer l'histoire des sciences, la politique des chaires au Collège de France, humanité environnementale, enquête et contre-enquête. And most recently, he has authored an annotated translation of texts by Max Weber. Today, he will help us put Japan in perspective in the grander scheme of environmental history, as he reflects on environment, Umwelt, Milieux, Fûdo, what is in a word, contemporary debates. Thank you all for being here this afternoon, and without further ado, we will now hear Professor Miller on the origin of Japan's modern environmental history. Thank you very much.
Hello.
Est-ce qu'en régie, vous pouvez nous passer sur l'écran de l'ordinateur les slides?
I can definitely go without slides if we need to. It's because I touched it, I swear. I know every time. Oh, look at that. Now, we'll see how this goes. Let me make sure. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for your patience. My name is Ian Miller. I use the he series of pronouns. I'm lucky enough to teach at a small college outside of Boston. I want to thank Aleksandra for bringing us all together, thank the staff who have been amazing, and also thank Aleksandra. Thank you for creating an intellectual community. That's what these jobs are supposed to do, but doing it is very difficult. And I have only been here for a few days, and yet it's obvious what's happening at EHESS, and that the kind of vibrant engagement that we all want out of our careers is what's happening here, and I'm grateful to be part of it. Aleksandra and I share graduate training with a number of folks, but not least one of our mentors, Carol Gluck. And Carol always said that talks of this sort should have a provocation. So that's my point today, is just to make a single provocation. My intervention is, I hope, simple and direct. It's meant to be provocative, to spur discussion and debate, rather than to proclaim certainty. It's a point that draws on elements of my ongoing research into the history of energy in modern Japan and Tokyo, part of a project I'm calling Fueling Tokyo, Japan in the Age of Global Energy. My point is this. We've been starting our environmental histories of modern Japan, specifically our histories of environmental opposition, environmentalism, in the wrong place and with the wrong people, and perhaps even in the wrong decade. Our books, textbooks, and lectures on this topic all tend to start in one place. They start here. Anyone been? I visited this place not too long ago, actually, in October. Anyone know where we are? Ashio, up above in the mountains above the city of Tokyo. The Ashio copper mine in Tochigi Prefecture where 30 to 40% of the copper used in the creation of Japan's remarkable electrical system was mined in the Meiji era. Those of us in Japanese environmental history have made the mistake of focusing too much, not the mistake of focusing here, but focusing too much of our attention on these sorts of environments, factories, mines, sites of major pollution incidents, as we look for the beginnings of modern environmental politics. This is not an argument that we should not look at such sites. They're critical, of course, but we've been drawn to them at the expense of other places, other dynamics that are more humble. We've done this in part out of an ideological fetish for radicalism and conflict. One of my mentors, Harry Haratunian, had a co-edited volume called Conflict in Japanese History, which put that idea front and center, building on the idea that real environmental protest and change are driven by violent protests of the sort that erupted in and around Ashio from 1907, where miners erupted into protests, and that real change must invariably be led by charismatic intellectuals who leave brilliant writings in the archives that Horiyuchi-san so eloquently evoked in her presentation this morning. Specifically, we've fallen under the spell of this remarkable man, Tanaka Shozo. I mean, my students, when I teach Meiji, we compare beards in each of the images. He often wins the contest. I ask them to take pictures with their cell phones, and at the end of the semester, we compare. I love Tanaka. He's a brilliant intellectual. And plus, he's just, look at his face speaks of politics and conflict and the kinds of issues that I love to engage with. He's a hugely romantic figure, and for many in the academy, and as is obvious, for me as well. I love reading Tanaka. I enjoy engaging with his work. He was an important figure, an elected member of the Japanese Diet who grew frustrated as he worked to earn recognition for peasants whose crops and bodies were being ravaged by pollution from the Ashio copper mine. In fact, in a Meiji version of some of the dynamics that Lisa evoked for us, body and environment were interpenetrated and understood to be such in the Tone River Basin and so on, in the places that Tanaka brought his politics into being. He grew so frustrated by 1901 that he resigned his seat and sought to transform himself into a martyr, and this from a man who had been tortured as a prisoner during the years of the Restoration, performing the dire and often lethal act of jikiso, or direct appeal to the emperor. It's an act that has become mythological. This from a historical print, and this from something also historical but quite different. It's the stuff of manga, the stuff of romantic fantasy, and the stuff of real environmental politics. This is not to argue that this is unimportant. It's simply to elevate the fact that Tanaka himself has come to represent a certain form of politics. Now, I'll skip this one for time. This is one of his co-authors, Kotoku Shusui. I'm emphatically not suggesting that Tanaka's efforts were unimportant or that we should not focus on the events at Ashio. They deserve a great deal of attention, but I do want to suggest that historians have perhaps, and our textbooks almost certainly, have become susceptible to the appeal of a certain kind of great man history. You see, my current work tells me that when we turn our attention to more quotidian spaces, places less charismatic, figures less charismatic, places like the streets of Yokohama and Tokyo in the closing decade of the 19th century, we begin to see that the origins of Japan's modern environmental politics were rather more diffuse and less dramatic than the heroic narratives that have grown up around Tanaka and Ashio. When we allow ourselves to linger in the urban bourgeois neighborhoods, the earliest places to install electricity, we begin to perceive a different origin point for modern Japanese environmental opposition and politics, a point of co-development that suggests broadly diverse engagements across the archipelago that has been left in the twilight of Tanaka's long, bright figure, left in the shadows. You see, the Edison-based direct current systems that delivered electricity before the spread of alternating current systems struggled to deliver current over long distances. This is well known, a great history origin story for, in fact, the field of STS as a whole. As such, they had to be built close to the homes and businesses of the relatively wealthy individuals who were able to install electrical lights early. They were, in a sense, in people's backyards. When we follow the copper wires out of those homes and shops, we end up in places such as this one, the Tokiwa Thermal Power Plant in Yokohama. Facilities like this one were a nuisance. They were loud, they were dirty, they belched smoke and sooty coal into the skies, and they brought traffic and workers onto quiet, generally affluent streets. They were revolutionary in a very different sense than Ashio or Tanaka. They were emblematic of the reality that the main lineage of Japan's modern environmental history has been one of accommodation between capital and the state, with conditional influences from workers and others who suffer the most obvious costs of the energy-intensive regime that we call modernity. One of the enduring paradoxes of modern energy culture is that those who tend to demand the most access to energy for personal consumption, folks like me, also tend to come from the social groups who experience the fewest material consequences of that culture in terms of health and well-being. Like capital, then, energy is distributed unevenly under modernity. Even as they began to demand electricity, wealthy urban Japanese began to experiment with legal actions akin to, not distinct from, akin to those happening in the mountains around Ashio. Experimenting with legal action and political pressure to keep unwanted facilities away from their homes, initiating a process of organized opposition to environmental costs, rooted in part in the sense that the soot pouring from this chimney, the chimney of the thermal power plants that brought direct current into homes and other centers of industrial production, must be damaging to health, to bodies. Even as they demanded access to the latest technologies, well-to-do customers began to invoke specific chemical compounds, and here I'm drawing on Watanabe Takehiro's work, to argue that those compounds were, quote, poisoning, unquote, not only the air, but also their children. The problem is sulfur dioxide, a resident of Yokohama living near this power plant argued in the Yokohama City Court in 1893. And it will poison my child. That is the origin of a distinct thread in the intertwined nature of the environmental politics that interest me here. This brings my time to an end, a simple hope, and I want to reassert the argument, not that we displace Ashio in our environmental histories when we lecture about the origins of these politics, but that we decenter it and teach ourselves to look at more humble dynamics, both in the mountains, but also in the cities, as folks walked through the well-lit streets that in certain ways defined the high-energy culture that we call modernity. Thank you.
The format which was suggested for this roundtable was that the speakers had a shorter time to make their presentations as to offer a possibility for everyone to have a discussion at the end of every presentation. So, if you want to know more about decentering Ashio, I'll first give the floor to our roundtable participants and then maybe a few questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
So, sorry, I was trying to be nice. Why do you call them humble?
Not so humble in some, thank you for the question. Because the records themselves are humble. The stories that come out of them, Tanaka generates heroic, what Carol would call heroic narratives. Grand stories of resistance that merit attention on the front pages of a newspaper. If you seek out the Yokohama resident, that quotation actually is from a newspaper article, and you will find it, this is from memory from when I first found it, but I believe it's on page 8 of the newspaper, and it's in a rather small article. And so where Tanaka generates appropriately a great deal of attention both historically and for historical actors, and we've you know, appropriately paid attention as such, the folks that I'm interested in fact, the folks very much like us. I mean, this is one of the things that environmental historians often debate is, in English we call it NIMBYism, not in my backyard. And I'm making an argument that NIMBYism is a powerful force in transforming environmental politics in line with the grain of the norm, in line with the dominant political culture and political economy, whereas Ashio and Tanaka represent a more radical, catastrophic, and in certain ways heroic narrative. And so in that sense, it's more humble. It's quotidian. It's everyday life. It is, in a sense, one could argue, more powerful in that it represents deeply vested interests that become normalized and naturalized. But the documents themselves are, in fact, quite humble. They're small court cases. They're complaints that go to the local administration. They involve the local police, perhaps. They usually involve neighbors dealing with each other and uniting. And we see this, of course, carrying into the modern present, the contemporary present, where we see a great deal of neighborhood organization. If you think about what's been successful in modern Japanese environmental politics, the rivers that Nakamura-sensei is so interested in protecting, how do we protect those? Well, we can do it at the national level with national law, which of course the river law is important, but it's also mobilizing constituencies at the locality. And I'm interested in that as the first step for because that's what I'm seeing in the records. I actually went into this following Tanaka, following the kind of bright, exciting narrative, the heroic narrative. What's happened is I've had to change my lectures to be far less exciting. So,
I have a follow-up question. How humble does humble get? Are we talking about urban populations who can read and write and know how to get to court? And what about the humbler humbles? Do we have any of those, and what are the sources involved in with those?
Very good question. It's hard to get more humble than a coal miner or a copper miner up in Ashio. And so one of the arguments, that's why I closed with a reframing of the argument. Decenter, not displace. I understand these to be part of a common shared vocabulary of opposition that's emerging. There are different interests at work within the broader discourse. But what is most striking to me is that we see similar sorts of logic deployed in the mountains as in the neighborhoods. But what is powerfully evident is that the wealthy urbanites see action far more quickly and with far less dramatic engagement than the organized labor that is incipient in Ashio. It took Ashio, they were seeing damaging effects really from the 70s, but you get into the 1880s and 1890s and it's obvious to most people what's happening. The fish stocks are plummeting. 3,000 fisherfolk lose their jobs on that river. 3,000. This is a relatively rural area. If you drive up, you can see the various hamlets as you move. And to this day, now it's close to a ski area, so it has a little bit more engagement. So it is both the humble and the more affluent on both ends of that spectrum. What I haven't seen yet is really poor neighborhoods in cities organizing. And that hasn't come to light. So I haven't seen neighborhood organizations that are not led by the literate, those who can afford legal counsel and might have connections to the city representatives, for example. Perhaps it's there, but I haven't found it.
Maybe just one or two questions from the audience, if there are any. Yes.
Thank you. I have a question that's linked to Aleksandra's question and to what you said in the end, that your lectures were getting less exciting. So my question was about how to narrate something that's humble, because of course the heroic narratives are really catching the attention and also good to remember. So I was wondering, on the narrative point of view and the writing history point of view, how do you cope with these less exciting stories?
I can tell you what I'm trying. Does this one work? Okay, thank you so much. I'll tell you what I try, and I'm not sure it works. So I'm doing it right now. Being really enthusiastic sometimes helps. So students love enthusiasm, but I happen to love what I do, so that's usually just authentic. One of the things I've been trying, and I'm working very hard on this in a variety of different ways, even the project that will probably come after the one I'm working on right now, I'm very interested in generating felt affective with an A, emotional felt responses between relationships between students and what we study. And especially when I'm in the northeastern United States at a very, very wealthy, affluent university, my students are more diverse than they have ever been historically, and yet 75% of them come from the top 20% of the income spectrum in the United States, and something like 40% of them come from the top 1%. They are incredibly well-to-do, and as graduates, they will become that 1% statistically. And so one of the motives here is if I can mobilize effective felt politics for them, when they become a CEO, a research scientist, engineer, or create something like, I don't know, Facebook, perhaps they will move and mobilize their actions based on sentiment, because we know that they will not remember that the Meiji Restoration took place in 1868 in 10 years. They will forget it. The social science tells us this, but they will remember habits of thought. We know that's what is durable with our students in terms of teaching. It's sad for us. The nerds like me, we remember 1868. I could give you the chronology of the Restoration, right now, but I want to mobilize what the social science tells me they will remember. And so a lot of my classes, Shigehisa Kuriyama and I co-taught a class called Asia in the Making of the Modern World, for example. And we started with a stereotypical American upper middle class living room, a photograph of the living room, and we historicized the objects in that living room and showed them through the methods of historical research how items in that household connect not only to Asia, but to Asia very long ago. And that gets you into things like if you move out of the living room and move into the medicine cabinet, you begin to get cold medicine, which of course draws on some of the similar compounds that are used in methamphetamine, which we know actually methamphetamine developed through the bioprospecting of the Honzo Gaku pharmacopoeia. So bioprospecting Edo period medicine and bringing that into the Meiji era, experimenting with those compounds, figuring out what they are, isolating them, and so on. And so all of a sudden, this thing that is the subject of Breaking Bad, a television show I've never watched, but I know it's about meth, and it's in cold medicine, right? All of a sudden, this thing that's within grasp for these students, right, connects very long ago. And that's not to collapse those histories, but to give them a sense of connection over time that can be very powerful. That's what I'm trying. Whether it works, I think Tanaka is a great way to start. So, but that's the attempt.
Are there any other questions? Hopefully we'll have time for a general discussion. Okay. Let's Suzuki-san. Hai, dozo.
Hi everyone, I'm Wakana Suzuki. I'm assistant professor at Osaka University, and now I'm a visiting scholar at University of Amsterdam. I would like to thank to the organizers, especially Aleksandra, giving me such a great opportunity to join the work, this symposium. As an anthropologist and a STS scholar, I'm working on human and microbe relationship, in particular fermentation practice in day-to-day life in the era of Anthropocene. In this speech, I will talk about a bit about my project. The concept of Anthropocene is warning that we have tons of problems, such as global warming, mass extinction, waste and air pollutions, and so on and so forth. We need to not only top-down governance and regulations by national and international governments or organizations, but we need also radical change our everyday life. According to the environmental scientists, the environmental crisis accelerated when human population rapidly increased and the GDP started to grow in 1950s. Mass production and mass consumptions are major cause of environmental crisis. Needless to say, Japan is one of the most consuming countries in the world. For instance, energy, wood, food, plastic, clothes, fabric, and various kind of resources. We need to radically change our lifestyle, what we eat, what we wear, how much energy we use, so on and so forth. In my research, I ask how people in Japan change their day-to-day life. I say kurashi because I cannot translate kurashi in proper English, from the mass consumption way to sustainable ways. The question also include other questions like what are the sustainable societies? What do you mean by sustainable? How we can imagine and design sustainable societies. I explore how this societal transformation emerged from the bottle, I mean from the everyday life, kurashi, and I call it a modern human social movement. Some natural and human disaster like Tohoku big earthquake, meltdown of the Fukushima nuclear power plant, and COVID lockdown, Japanese people, mostly younger generation, started to question the standard and normative life in Japan. Not only salaryman, long working hours, but also they started question food in convenience store and supermarket, and also the infrastructures like gas and electricities. Young generations started to move rural areas and exploring new lifestyle, which is connected in their surroundings, Fûdo, such as their local communities, landscape, and microclimate. Even in the city, like in Tokyo and Osaka, young generation started to explore new lifestyle. For example, farming, making small garden, making compost, mending clothes, repairing furniture, and renovating a house. I took this picture in Soni Village, Nara Prefecture. During my fieldwork, I met a couple who moved from big city Nagoya to Soni Village. They renovated the old house and started a guest house. They built an oven by themselves. This is a picture. Sometimes the wife works as a massage therapist in the next town. Husband grows vegetable and bakes sourdough bread and sells them. These people have a several livelihood. They don't spend much money. Rather, they enjoy creating a day-to-day life, kurashi, by making, repair, and mending. I'm interested in this emerging shift from day-to-day life. In particular, I focus on making fermented and preserved food. In Japan, there are many fermented and preserved food, such as miso, shoyu, sake, nukazuke, umeboshi, and so on. For young generations like Soni Village in the previous slide, making food is crucial for their everyday life. I ask how making food in our kitchen transform our sensibilities, ethics, and our body towards our surroundings. I call Fûdo. And I also ask how food making is connected to the other kind of making practice, like making compost, mending clothes, and building a house. I try to make umeboshi, miso, koji, mold, and sourdough bread by myself, because experiencing myself is an essential method to know something for anthropologists. I noticed that my body gradually changed affected by food, microbe, and weather and temperature, and so on. I show a bit of example of umeboshi making. You can make umeboshi only limited season, rainy season. It's called tsuyu. It is very seasonal work. It starts from June when ume is harvested. When you miss ume in the supermarket, you cannot make that year. You have to wait for another year. After a while, I put salt and ume in a bottle. I need to dry them. Unfortunately, June and July are typhoon season. So to dry the ume, I need to find 3 days, 3 nights, sunny days. I have to check condition of ume, weather forecast, and sky every day. But it's a bit difficult to find the sunny day for 3 days. And for 3 months, umeboshi making, I gradually started to notice that subtle differences: smell of ume, touch of ume, humidity, temperature, sky, so on and so forth. So weather and ume tell me what I should do. So I'm exploring this kind of bodily and affective relationships between human and non-humans in making, repairing, and mending. This bodily transformation and ethical transformation and affective transformation would be a clue to explore what are the sustainable societies. Thank you for listening.
Switching. I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to do more because you speak about younger generations, but what are the social characteristics of the people you are telling us about?
Thank you for your questions. Because of the remote technology for remote work, younger generation shouldn't they don't have to be in Tokyo or Osaka. So and many Japanese companies say they don't have to come to company every day. So gradually the people go to rural area. Mainly designers or some but some mostly they can create their job by themselves, like jiegyo, that kind of people.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful work, and I wonder if you've seen Victoria Lee's Arts of the Microbial World.
Yeah, I have the book.
Wonderful, great. So you should do a panel. The two of you would really do wonderful. It's a wonderful book on related topics, but not the same. It's that great synergy that comes with close work, but not too close. I'm curious about the term kurashi. And I wonder if you could speak with us about how you're using it, and again, how your actors are using it. And I think I Googled kurashi while you were talking, and two things came up that caught my mind. After all the Weblio dictionary definitions, one was kurashi nyuzu from NHK. So it's just a category of news on kurashi. So I'm curious about that category and what is included and what isn't. And also kurashi dogu, so tools for kurashi. And both of those speak to perhaps, again, there's a theme in some of my questions, I guess, to markets and capitalism and consumption. And I sense in your argument an argument kind of suggesting a more humble approach to kurashi in the Anthropocene. So how is that tension between consumption and the needs of this sustainable moment playing out for you and your actors? I'm happy to rephrase that because that was a complicated question. I apologize.
Yeah, thank you for your question. For the younger generation who move to rural area, for them, kurashi is a kind of the way to remove from the long hours working lifestyle, because in urban area people have to work and their daily life is occupied by the working. So avoiding from the wrong hours working time, they want to make the other type of kurashi, the way to living. And I think kurashi means kurashi include eating, what we wear, where we live, but also it's not only the material thing, but also how we spend time with the family and how we spend time with friends. So it's a connections also. And your question about capitalism is very interesting because Japanese people use a lot of words like teine na kurashi. But it's very connected to the capitalism because the teine na kurashi sells a lot of kitchen tools. So, but I want to, but this younger generation doesn't. They are not interested in that kind of capitalism, teine na kurashi. But they try to make another way to kurashi. I'm interested in that kind of kurashi. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question to both of these questions. If I imagine rural Japan, I imagine older people living in villages and old ladies maybe mending clothes and making umeboshi and that kind of stuff. And so in a certain sense, the idea that I have of rural Japan that I haven't really visited that much is linked to sustainable living, but older generations living in this sustainable fashion. Do you think that this kind of idea that you have of kurashi could also be used for a more traditional or a way of life that has been maybe just used by the older generations without having the day-to-day work in Tokyo? Can we also use kurashi for older generations, or is that something that you would rather use for these younger people who have decided to leave the city?
Thank you for your question. In this research, and for the younger generation, their way to creating kurashi is a mixture of the traditional way and a more modern way. For example, they use a lot of SNS like Facebook and Instagram, and because the umeboshi making, we can pick up recipes from Instagram and YouTube, and then they can adjust with their surroundings, what they have in their local community. So it's a combination of modern and tradition. So I'm interested in that kind of a combination as well.
Are there any questions from the audience?
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I wanted to follow up on that point you made about social media and tie in with the question about capitalism. And you mentioned that they're not interested, you think, in the capitalist aspects of kurashi. And I thought that was interesting because what I see in English language social media is a sort of idealization and commodification of this lifestyle that sounds very similar to kurashi, but then that is marketed, and there are ways of monetizing that which are non-traditional, but endorsements of products, sometimes very subtly, other kinds of tie-ups, links to Amazon stores. And I wondered, does that happen in the case of the people you're studying who seem to be escaping all of that? Does that happen in Japan? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. I think some people are connected to the Instagram and marketing and Amazon, but I focus on this young generation who followed the concept of nariwai. Nariwai is proposed by Hiroshi Ito, who proposed the concept of nariwai. How can I say? It's a long story, but he tried to change the society, which is different direction from the capitalism. He doesn't deny capitalism, but he tried to make another alternative way of living, and because they question the capitalism. How to say? Capitalism society, they try to keep distance, and they are trying to find alternative way. I focus on that direction. Yeah, of course it is connected, but yeah, thank you.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you for your nice talk. And I have a question that you mentioned about Fûdo. So I think the Fûdo is very famous in the context of Watsuji Tetsuro. So however, recently we can find very often the Fûdo in mass media or the SNS. So however, I think your definition and the current definition of the Fûdo could be different from the Watsuji's definition. So I think that such a difference is highly related to the like a capitalism. So what is your definition of the food, and what is the differences between the traditional food and your food?
Yeah, thank you. I haven't thought deep into the Watsuji Tetsuro yet. But as an anthropologist, I try to look at how the practitioner try to relate. For example, the young generation make a new livelihood based on their community or the landscape or climate. I want to know how they recognize the food, or how they how ontologically food is created by the practice of the young generation. So I will think about that further. Thank you for your suggestion.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
I would like to hear, thank you for the talk. I would like to hear your opinion on 2 points. Number one, for the past 3 years, the pandemic, we know like in Japan there's no lockdowns, but we had a long stay home campaign. Does this pandemic period actually promoted the behavior of the young generation to go back to this slow life and the traditional way of kurashi? And my second question I want to hear from you is, when the young generation, they tend to search for a different way to go their traditional life, do they also have like interest in making wagashi, the traditional Japanese confectionery? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. The first question, yeah, definitely the COVID period, young generation aware that working is not the end of the life. They can have more life in alternative way. So I think many people went to the the rural area. It's called iju, or we call it dual life. Even though you can have house in Tokyo, but also in Shiga. Then you commute to Tokyo and Shiga. It's called dual life, and the iju is moving, and dual life is getting more popular and popular now. And many local city and rural village promote that kind of moving. And I think, and for second question, I think, some young generation are interested in making wagashi based on what they harvest in that community. I think I know one wagashi maker in Noto prefecture. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Okay, Aleksandra.
Okay, so thank you to my predecessor, who it's not easy to go after you, but I will try, and I will try by explaining. We had the same training, so I'm into interventions too, but I have been in France for far too long, and in France we do things in 3 points. Somehow you have to find 3 points to make, otherwise you're not a serious scholar. And so I decided to cut what they here they call it cut the pear into 2, and I decided to have 2 points. Okay, so it's neither Carol nor France. It's the country of its own, and it's 2 points, and both are both related to industry. So we could call it a unified intervention. And one of the things that fascinates me is that working on technology and working in France, for the most part, we somehow talk a lot about post-industrial. Post-industrial this, post-industrial that. And one of the things that I really try to start with is to say that, you know, despite much talk about post-industrial world, I hate to remind you guys, we are living in a very much of an industrial world, and in some cases very much an industrializing world. And if we needed any reminder of that, COVID-19 pandemic presented us with some powerful ones. Powerful reminders of how our lives and well-being depends on industrial production and global supply chains. We don't need, I hope, reminder that most of the consumer products we use are manufacturing components and industrial materials that are used in Europe and North America, are produced on other continents. And while many Europeans and North Americans, and some Japanese too, can aspire to eat local produce and celebrate local craft cultures, we cannot opt to take local medication. We cannot opt to consume locally sourced electronics or pharmaceutical products. And so, in many places in Europe and North America, our communities no longer bear visible signs of industrial activity. And in Berlin, in Amsterdam, New York, Paris, Baltimore, we take deindustrialization as an established fact. And we have moved on to contemplate our post-industrial knowledge economy. Well, guess what? Our lives still depend on industrializing places, industrializing economies in cities. Even we would be hard-pressed to name, let alone put on a map. So, to recent global commodity chain crisis notwithstanding, our understanding of the shift in global geographies of industrial production, our understanding, what we know about it, hardly matches our dependence on it. And so my first point is to simply say, yeah, great talk about post-industrial, I agree with some of it, but honestly, there is much more work to understanding industrial unfinished business of understanding industrial outside of Europe and North America and taking stock of the nature of the ongoing global processes. And Japan is a good place to start for several reasons, and not just because I know something about it, but honestly, and we can talk about this more in discussion, but Japan is a particularly interesting place to start this discussion. And I have written in particular about why that is the case, and we can talk about it in discussion. But in short, what I mean to say, and the intervention is about saying industry is here to stay. We're living in an industrializing and industrialized world. Being in denial about it is not going to help us think about environmental crisis. So getting rid of the denial would be a really good thing to begin with. And my second point is about a tacit but palpable understanding in much of the environmental writing that somehow industry is the manifestation of thinking about progress in terms of algorithms of expansion, right? Progress as expansion, how does it manifest? Well, industry. Well, it turns out that not all industry was historically like that. And there again, Japan may be a good place to start looking at some of this history of a different self-understanding of an industry. And I'm having in mind this very particular example from salt producers in the Seto Naikai, Seto Inland Sea in Japan, where my ongoing research suggests that there are industrial actors in 19th century, so not so long ago, who defined themselves and defined their alliances in terms of slowing down. Industrial actors, I repeat, think about themselves as actors of coordination aiming to slow down, to reduce their production in a coordinated manner. The massive amount of energy these folks are putting into this coordination over vast distances and over long periods of time of several decades is a fact that testifies to the importance of thinking about industry differently. I would like to share your passion for empathy and affect, but I'm not there yet. But what I'm thinking more in terms of empirical evidence that shows that there are industrial actors who think about prosperity very differently than what we assign to them to be doing. They think about joint survival. They think about industry not as a matter of continuous growth and production increase. And they think about diversity of actors. So in other words, they are not industrial actors that subscribe to algorithm of progress as expansion. And again, this is not that far away. So my second intervention would be to say, we talk a lot about impunity of industry. We turn them into these other people that are not understanding the environmental stakes. I deal with an example of industrial cartels, or they're not cartels, they're alliances, who are going against the political injunction to develop the domain wealth and saying we need to coordinate the slowdown so that everyone can survive. Otherwise, we're going to go into a boom and bust cycle. This is 19th century Japan. This is an essential industry such as salt. You don't have salt, you die. So it's not a joke, and it's not a minor thing. And so if these industrial actors can self-identify with something other than a perpetual growth, then there must be a way of thinking about industry differently, and thinking industry with environment, environment with industry, without assuming or giving the industry impunity in perpetuity. So there may be a point in time where it may seem like industry has certain impunity. They get to do kinds of things that we don't like them to be able to do. But this is not written in stone. And it doesn't have to stay this way. And I don't think we should give it to them. And so that's one thing that I would like to put on the table. I said, let's look at Japan and let's bring to the table examples of an industry that functions differently. And then I'm sure, as it always does, someone from Europe is going to raise their hand and say, well, that's exactly how it happened in blah, 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 right? And then you end up with not Japan being an example that confirms the rule, but one of many examples that you can do things differently. You just need to kind of wrap your mind around that. Beyond the heroic narrative, and this is where our work echoes, beyond the heroic narrative of we fought them and it's the Goliath, and A, we know how the Goliath ends, but B, also, there is no reason to give up without trying. And I think that that's what the dialogue between industry and environment has not done right. I think industrial history and environmental history has given up on each other far too early and for not that much. So without much on it, I think I'm going to leave the floor open for some darts.
Any questions from our roundtable participants?
Thank you, Aleksandra. I wanted to know, what are the arguments of your people dealing with salt in the end of the 19th century?
It's work in progress, so I have a couple of answers to that. There are different arguments based on which sources are you reading, right? But if you scratch the surface, what it is that they're actually saying, you look at what they're doing and what they're saying, it turns out that they're trying to define something that's a logic of socioeconomic rentability. These are no actors' categories, obviously. But they're talking about, we have big producers that can live through a bust year. But we have small producers who can't do that. And we don't want small producers to be abandoning after every crash of salt prices. So we need to figure out a way to balance this, right? So what they do is they unite every year. They sit around the table and we discuss what are we going to produce. They model mathematically. I mean, these people are not joking. They sit down and they model mathematically, if the price is that and if the price crashes to this, how much are people going to lose? So they model this, and then you model different sizes of production across Inland Sea, which is, most people don't need a reminder, but this is extremely fragmented political environment. And by the way, they are going against the political injunction, right? There are two political injunctions that they're going against that. So the politics of each domain, and there are many of them, at least 10 or 15 around, telling them you have to produce more because the domain has to get rich. So the political injunction is produce more. The political injunction also says you don't guys get to align each other. You don't get to talk across the domain boundaries. We don't want that. And what do? They gather across domain boundaries. And we don't have many examples of things that worked like that. And salt, because it's an essential good, may be the reason why they were not decapitated. But they get together and they try to negotiate every year how to decrease. So they do two things that they're not supposed to be doing. And that, for me, is fascinating. Fascinating example how industry, at a certain point, can mathematically model what it means to survive on the long run in order to explicitly not go through another boom and bust cycle. Because that's the origin of the alliance. The origin of the alliance is like, we had boom, we had bust, ain't doing this anymore. We can't do this another time. Like, we had two of those, we won't survive a third one. So what do? Right? And that's how they get together. That's why they get together. They don't have it's not an environmental story. It's not a profit story. These are not major political. These are humble. This is in Ian's context a very, very humble group. They don't control prices. It's not a cartel. It's not OPEC at all. But they are discussing, and we have their meeting minutes. Meeting minutes you take them for what they are, but we still have some idea of what they're discussing. And they are trying to balance multiple constraints. Each domain is different. Each domain has different politics. And there are many around them around the table. But to answer your question, what is their reasoning? The reasoning is that we can't do boom and bust all the time. And we have to all survive somehow, small and big. We have different problems, and we need to figure this out.
Thank you, Aleksandra. My question is, in a sense, simple. It's change over time. So how does do these data and does this story lead to a periodization for you, either industry specific, spatially specific, or at a national level? So how does this slowing down, which I really quite enjoy, because you're right, everyone but historians of industry and capitalism tends to, I was trained as a cultural historian, and capitalism becomes abstracted. It's just a floating signifier that doesn't actually engage with pricing and manufacture and so on. It becomes just this driver that mysteriously explains so much without specificity. Here you're taking us into the calculations and actions and practices of specific commodity production, sale, and so on. How does that change over time? So what periodizations, what time scales are you thinking in, and do we segment time differently based on the kind of study that you're bringing forward?
That's a very good question. I think in terms of periodization, it brings us to what Noémi and I have been doing for 5 years now, which is getting between a Tokugawa and a Meiji person trying to question 1868. So it doesn't really matter if your students forget about it, because honestly, it wasn't such a big deal. right. But so it does help us, because most of this action that I'm talking about in terms of salt alliances happens on a scale of the 19th century, and it starts working just before the transition, and then it works so well that the Meiji government, it takes them a while to figure out what's actually working, and then they kind of take it over in 1905. So it changes the thinking about the 19th century. It gets us to think about 19th century more than, there is no Bakumatsu here. Bakumatsu doesn't work. Meiji doesn't work. So it's more like Edo Koki and Shoki Meiji maybe, right? But it's really just, there is no, again, this is one of those examples with 1868 didn't change anything. 1905 did, but 1868 did not change much. So in that sense, it's a provocation, but I don't know whether it's because we want to see more of these examples that I'm seeing it, or is it, but that's at this stage, this is what I see. On national slowdown, I mean, salt is it's a very special case, right? And it is possibly, at this scale, a unique case. But I'm not arguing for representativity. I'm not saying we have missed this major characteristic of Japanese early industry, and this is that they were not seeking profit, they were not seeking growth, they were seeking slowdown and socioeconomic rentability. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there is this one industry, a basic industrial sector, in which there is a hell of a lot of effort put into slowing down for a particular reason, with a modeling that says you're not going to lose money if you do that, because they're obviously interested in money. So they're modeling mathematically why it is better for everyone, including those who only think about profit, to slow down, in fact. And that is fascinating, especially in a country that doesn't have a zero. So go figure out how to translate those. I mean, it took me a while to figure out how the math works, because every time you need to add a zero, you have to change the unit of measure, and that was not easy to figure out. But again, effort into trying to slow down, not because it's environmentally friendly or not because they are hostile to making money, but because on the long run, this boom and bust doesn't work. And that's an industry that understands that, right? So I don't know why is it that we can't figure out how to make this clear mathematically. That's, I guess, my question. But it doesn't change anything on a national scale. So it's not going to change entirely how we tell the Meiji story or how we tell the transition story, but it does change a bit of a chronology and gives us a solid example of how things can be done successfully differently over long periods of time.
I want to ask, who is the mathematician? Because what is the connection between solve industry and mathematician? Why they trust the math?
The salt maker is the mathematician. It's the salt maker that has written this very obscure treaty in which he models the math. And this is actually not it's a chapter 12 argument. There is 20 chapters, so it's not the main argument, but it is there, and it's the producer who does it. And I call it mathematical modeling, but it's actually just a listing of scenarios that says, if the price of salt is X for X, and then if your expenses are this, and if we abstract your domain charges, because we don't know what each domain charge is, and if the price falls to that, your revenue is that, and therefore, if the prices is below this, you are gonna make X money. And then he goes down by each price, right? Each, Hyakuoku for 10 mei or something, and then X number more for the same price, so right? And that's what I mean by modeling. So it's not sophisticated, super duper modeling that Antoine Tsired does, but it is definitely a 19th century version of modeling, showing that it's actually not so much about how much money you're gonna make, but how much money you are not going to lose if the price goes down and your losses get progressive.
I have a quick follow-up question on that. What's the role of individual agency? If there hadn't been these great mathematicians making salt or producing salt, or salt producer mathematicians, or could that be the answer to this kind of exception to the rule? And that's also bouncing back on the space question, because there might be other salt producers elsewhere in Japan. Do you have any idea how that would play a role?
Okay, I think I got everyone distracted with this economic modeling business. These are producers who do the basic math. They're not mathematicians, right? So it's not like a mathematician that happens to be an owner of a salt production or anything like that. So it's not an exceptional skill. It's like basically basic accounting, copy-paste 17 different scenarios, right? I think that it's worth to remember that Seto Inland-sea does concentrate over 90% of Japanese salt production historically. So the guys who are sitting around the table are basically the most of the industry, right? Except Guillaume Skaga, right? That also has they also have a very, very ancient salt industry, but they're much up further north, right? So this is an industry-wide slowdown, which is why it's mind-blowing. You have an industry that happens to be concentrated in one place, and all of it is sitting around the table trying to figure out how to do less. So this is not an epiphenomenon, in a sense, right? It's not a small thing. And again, it's very humble because they're doing it under the radar. Not everyone knows what they're doing. People are, especially in our friends at Hagi and in Mitajiri, they know what's going on, and they have intendants who know what's going on. So it's not like they're not resistance or anything, but they try to stay under the radar. Their sources are super dispersed. And they write for themselves. It's literally like a memo written by one person for his 25 members of the Conseil Scientifique of I don't know what. It's not meant to circulate. It's not meant to be legible to Aleksandra or anyone else. It's an internal document, right? But the impact, so it's a humble source, but the impact on it, I think over time is massive, right?
It's a version of Ronald Dorr on literacy. You're talking about the spread of mathematical literacy as a precursor to the emergence of modern Japan, and whether that precursor question I'm bracketing, you could answer it however you wish, but it strikes me that you're offering in the English language literature, something novel. In the Japanese literature, I think there's probably some work there that could background and provide footnotes to support this in that broader representative sense to help make that argument. But what I hear, amongst many other things, is that the spread of a mathematical literacy enables a particular form of governance and economic practice that is exemplary and useful in today's world. But also that, that spread of literacy is that really interesting question. And because most humanists are allergic to numbers, we've ignored it. And so I just wanted to flag that as another thing in that chapter 12 of 20. It could definitely come to the fore maybe as an argument for the field, or an article breaking out of it. It's cool.
We might have time maybe for one question.
Thank you so much. I was just really struck by this reference to salt and the example, because I kept thinking about King Lear and Cordelia's expression of love for her father. And when this is Shakespeare, and just to summarize, King Lear had 3 daughters, and 2 of them expressed their love for the father in terms of property, so gold and silver. And then salt was Cordelia's example, and she chose salt because love is something that is unquantifiable. And so that is really interesting, like the example that you're showing here kind of distorts that example that's so familiar in the Anglophone literature. And I was really curious how you are thinking about that sort of, like, that emblematic role of salt in explaining what Steve Chapin refers to as the matter of credibility. And so, like, how does what you're explaining here perhaps reflect upon kind of the exercise of scientific or expert credibility? Is this what's at stake as well? Because salt, I think we're talking about salt here as if we all know what it's for. But if it's not about something that is connected to property in that traditional, in that European sense of property, is it not something that's about giving life? And it's about our metabolic processes as well, or fermentation, etc. Like, it's connected to life in some way. And I haven't heard you really talk about it quite in that sense, but I think it's implied. Is that right?
You caught me off guard with the Shakespeare thing. I was like, am I going to get killed here? No, you're just going to have interference, Aleksandra. So I try to evacuate for now the symbolics of it, right? I stick to the fact that the body cannot work without salt. Human life is not possible. Any life is not possible. So that's what makes it universal. I completely follow you on the fact that we talk about salt as if we know what it is. We have a colleague who is a medievalist, and he worked on a 1445 register, the only surviving trade register. And it turns out that in Japan, in medieval period, we trade one kind of wood. It's a wood culture, but there is one kind of wood, one kind of rice, one kind of barley, and 18 kinds of salt. We're in 1445, so it's a very stratified product. And depending on what you do, what you want to do with it, you have 18 different kinds of it, right? Bingo being the most important one, right? So in fact, salt is salt. I'm starting to repeat myself with coal is coals, but in fact, it's a very different thing based on the end, right? And it is not just food; it is production, right? It is not just direct consumption; it's fermentation, and it's tanneries, and it's works into biomaterials, I guess, too, right? So it's all over the place. But what makes it striking in Japan is that you would think that in Japan you can make it anywhere, right? But you can't. There's only a few places where you can do, and they happen to be around an inland sea. And in my period in 19th century, they're divided over a multiple, they're politically fragmented, right? So I'm trying to establish how many domains have something to say about what these guys are doing. So I didn't get to think about symbolics of it, but I may actually have to reread King Lear, and then I'll get back to you on that.
Maybe we can keep the further questions if there are any for after our last presentation, so we can keep to the time. Do you have a PowerPoint or no?
He's trying to make me feel better.
Okay.
Thank you a lot for your invitation, and especially because I am in no case specialist of Japan, but as interested in transnational history, I sometimes have to cross and travel to Japan, so I have to apologize first, and I'm keen and interested in your comments for that. And second point, I have to explain that I'm not an historian of ideas, but rather historian of words, not in the sense that words would be opposite of actions, but as good hints in order to reconstruct the actor's point of view and to avoid anachronism in history. I am following Austin's view and interested in how we do things with words. In their book on the environment, Ward, Robin, and Serlin rightly stress the historicity of the expression and its meaning in the second half of the 20th century. What does it mean exactly? Let's have a look at the Oxford English Dictionary. Meaning the, frequently with the natural world or physical surroundings in general, either as a whole or within a particular geographical era, especially as affected by human activity. This expression, which has become a category of public action, is preceded by an article used in the singular, designates a totality, and functions as a proper noun. The environment is an anthropocentric and extremely generic category that includes both the natural and social agents that surround human life. Its promotion within institutional frameworks, notably the United Nations at the end of the 1960s, has polarized its uses to this day. Many people are currently looking for alternatives to a category that seems far too managerial and administrative. My aim is to explore a whole series of linguistic attempts that have been flourishing over the last 40 years or so and effectively present themselves as critical alternatives to the environment. Milieux in plural, ambiance in plural as well, atmosphère in plural, Stimmungen all in plural, and also maybe Fûdo. So I wouldn't be inclined to diagnose the end of the environment, but rather its persistence, at least to this day, and its cohabitation with a whole series of other terms that are nonetheless borne by more confidential actors, institutions, and arenas. These alternative names come from the academic world, which is also our own world, and hence the interest in historicizing them. Since the early 20th century, the French word milieu has been criticized for being too deterministic, too mechanistic. The title of an article published in 1952 by the philosopher Georges Canguilhem, Le vivant et son milieu, immediately indicated that the aim was to oppose a universal, overhanging apprehension of the milieu, in singular, with a situated perspectivist characterization of it. This meant using the word in the plural as opposed to the singular form denounced by Canguilhem by Kengelem in 10 or reading the behaviorists. His article was a great success, particularly with Gilbert Simondon and Gilles Deleuze, and has been translated in many languages till nowadays. Regarding now geography, we find other words and other connotations. From the mid-1960s onwards, the importation of North American New Geography brought the category of space, translated in French as espace, to the fore in French geography. Also known as spatial analysis, analyse spatiale, this practice challenged the ideographic and mesological study which was dominant in France till the 1950s. Its promoters developed a model-based approach to geographic space, identifying recurrent forms of organization, and the aim was clearly nomothetic. From the 1980s onwards, a whole series of proposals sought to break with the supposed objectivism of the category of espace. To do so, they mobilized the term territoire, but also milieu, which had been re-cementized at the time. This is particularly the case for Augustin Berck, a specialist in the cultural geography of Japan, who takes up and resurrects Louis-Adolphe Bertillon's term misology as an instrument for overcoming the opposition between subjectivism and objectivism, and in this framework, environment is clearly rejected as belonging to the second set. I quote, "Just as Cézanne had to go through abstraction to rediscover the profound meaning of things and thus reunify space, so our society will have had to go through the abstraction of the subject from the world, through the objectification of the milieu as environment, to finally transform itself into a society that has become conscious of its own gaze. The milieu is particularly praised for its ability to escape all forms of dualism." I quote, in French, "Le milieu est à la fois naturel et culturel, le milieu est à la fois subjectif et objectif, le milieu est à la fois collectif et individuel." And so from the 1980s onwards, Berck would re-cementize all terms, misology, ecumene, landscape, and multiply neologisms, médiance, trajectivité, and so on. The fortunes of the mesology promoted by Berck go far beyond the cooperation of geographers. Around what has also become a watchword in a world beset by environmental crisis, he has brought together architects, urban planners, philosophers, artists, among others. There is a sort of mesological community which has emerged. It is really interesting to see how he deals with, in his interpretation of Watsuji Tetsuo's Fûdo, emblematic of the re-cementization brought about by transnational circulation, and more particularly of the contemporary emphasis on subjective appropriations of environmental issues. I cannot go into detail, but interestingly, he stresses the fact that Watsuji himself had to circulate and to travel to Germany and to confront to Martin Heidegger's Being in Time in order to create his Fûdo with a very German genealogy. If you look at the book by Watsuji, Herder, Hegel, Ratzel, Lebensraum, and so on. As you know, the book was a great success, and Watsuji's lack of criticism of Japanese imperialism during the Second World War has meant that the work is counted among the classics of the nippological genre, which essentially consists of arguing the irreducibility of Japanese culture to Western models. In the preface in the foreword of the French translation, Berck offers a reflexive return that makes the question of determinism the key issue in his various appropriations of the work. Looking back on his first reading in 1969, in the English translation, Berck considers that there is nothing surprising that the book fell from his hands, like yet another essay on the determination of cultures by climate. While he blames the English translation for such a reading, he praises, I quote, his training as a geographer, which would have long since shown him the futility of such conceptions. The French translation he proposed 40 years later was affected by this, as he did not hesitate to create neologisms, such as médiance for Fûdo, to avoid any reduction of the text to any kind of determinism. Augustin Berck was thus adopting the practice of Heidegger's translators, entirely dedicated to countering in advance any reductionist reading of the master's work. Even if reading the Japanese text led him to say that, I quote, Watsuji rejects any confusion with determinism, Berck nonetheless asserts that he would not have lived up to his program in practice. His analyses substituted, I quote, the impressions of the traveler for the study of the worldview specific to the societies concerned. His position is therefore in the wake of Watsuji, or rather of the book's preamble and chapter 1, rather than that's illustrated in chapters 2 to 5. Over the past 30 years, as the category of the environment has taken hold in international institutions and everyday life, a number of criticisms have emerged in the humanities and social sciences. In Surroundings, Etienne Benson quotes historians of science Bruno Latour and Donna Haraway, and in an article, Bruno Latour and Donna Haraway, who both declare how it is impossible to still use environment. In Mesopolitic Farhad Thailand, meanwhile, he evokes the case of anthropologist Tim Ingold. In The Perception of the Environment, he criticizes the opposition between anthropocentrism and ecocentrism, and in his view, both presuppose the idea that there is such a thing as one great environment, I quote. Yet, despite their conventional opposition, these two positions share more in common than meets the eye. Both presuppose a global perspective. For both, there is just one big environment, identified with the order of nature. But by its very vastness, this all-embracing environment is profoundly alien to human experience. It is, as David Cooper puts it, much too big to be lived in. One cannot relate to its components. The environment we relate to, by contrast, is the one that surrounds us, that constitutes our milieu and our ambiance. And this is spherical rather than global in its topology. In contrast to the environment in the singular, valid for all, so broad that it is foreign to human experience regarding the position of these specialists, Ingold contrasts the human experience of an environment that surrounds us, spherical and non-topological, and which is basically better rendered by the world milieu or ambience. These three contemporary heroes of the environmental humanities, as we quote them today, share a critique of the abstract category of the environment, which has come to dominate. In the face of this, many, like Tim Ingold, are striving for different vocabulary.
Thank you so much. Nice to meet you. And this is really fun and interesting work. If I am making that happen, let me know. I think the broad question I want to ask is time, because of course it's being and time. And so I'm wondering if the categories that your various actors and that you are offering us imply work with, how do they imply or work with different time scales, different functions of time, different understandings of time? And just to be more specific, but I'm more interested in the broader question, but in more specific ways, I think at the close, you brought us to time scale in the invocation of ambiance and milieu versus environment, which of course imply an anthropocentrism or at least a human-centeredness of some sort, human relationality. But more broadly, just really interested in thinking about the time aspect of the discussion and how you might bring that into tension with Fûdo and environment and ambiance, etc.
How to say it? First, a lot of these people present big issues and long narratives, very often Eurocentric narratives, which often begin with the Greeks and end with nowadays. There is somewhere in the 19th century, in the 20th century, depends on the different authors, a break, a period where the ambience has been lost and a deterministic definition or comprehension of milieu dominates. And so there is very often the representation that we have to come back to what was better before. Not always a simple way back, but we have to think about it. So I would say time is there in the huge genealogies they are presenting.
Yes, so this is a question, not a provocation. So let's say we forget about the environment. We go for environmental humanities. What does that mean? In other words, if we abstract what we have right now in the environment field, what needs to happen to construct environmental humanities that is that you think we should have, and I probably agree?
That's a huge work.
Horizon 2017.
First, maybe we have to understand what is environmental humanities and what is the history of environmental humanities. So, environmental humanities is the newborn meta-discipline, first born in Australia, in the framework of the division between humanities and social sciences. So on the side of humanities and not social sciences, so for us it's something exotic. And is something which has been developed first by a specialist of literature, philosophy, history a bit, okay? That is environmental humanities as it dominates first. That does not mean that that social scientists were not interested in and did not work with, but it had a a great role in the framing of what it means and how you deal with that and how you manage and how you work in the environmental humanities. So some people say, okay, now we have to switch to environmental studies. Okay, but and so in order to gather humanities and social sciences working on environmental issues. But in both cases, we see that there are people who are totally apart or totally lost. The people belonging to what in Australia they call environmental sciences. So that's a strange story, because it's a story of interdisciplinarity, which is for us in France very narrow at the beginning, which tries to expand, but I don't know if it goes till working with ecological science. So I think that's maybe the next step.
We'll be taking questions for our last speaker, but also for all the participants of the round table, if there are any questions left. Yes.
Thank you. I would have a question for Jan Miller, please. So I wrote my PhD thesis on Ashio Coppermine, and I got my PhD out of, I know. Quite recently, like 3 or 4 years ago, I got a PhD out of it. So, of course, the suggestion of decentering Ashio seems a little bit provocative, at least to me, but I know it's nothing personal. But I take your point of the fact that industrialization, to use a swear word, and out of matter of time, was not always conflictual or through conflictual politics. But I'm still wondering how to deal with the normalization, so to say, of environmental and social consequences of this industrialization. Living with pollution, for instance, of living next to a thermal power station in your case. Sometimes this normalization was subtle and not always violent, but I think that still coercion or repression was looming around. And that's also what a case such as the Ashio mine one reminds us of. So we've been, some colleagues talk of acculturation to pollution, for instance, like a kind of a cultural integration. And this also links with Annie Horiuchi's talk this morning. So I would like to ask you, how do we deal with the contentious aspect of, let's say, the development of energy or power in Japan, and how not to lose sight of also the conflictual aspects, so to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Ashio, lest you think I don't value the topic, it is how I always have begun my lectures. And so this is often how I think about what is worth researching. What am I teaching a room full of students, and why am I doing it? So how do I think more with greater depth about the things that I'm doing? It's a self-critical move. I think my answer, in a sense, and this is not intentional, is to agree. So that it's not either or, it's always both and. And I think that's what I'm wanting to highlight with the argument of decentering, is when we decenter, we see urban actors, wealthy actors, middle class actors, and upper middle class actors playing very important political roles at the level of local politics that then ramifies upward into national politics. And so I could not agree more. I think what the work I'm engaged in right now, you know, every book has a big, stupid argument, right? Every one of our books says something very basic. And the argument that I think is coming together in the book right now is hegemonic capitalism, right? That it is that the functions of energy are deeply uneven in their expressions in urban space, and that unevenness is expressed and focused most clearly through space which is overlaid with class. And so coercion, one area is witnessing pollution and does not have the capacities for resistance. The absence of urban-based pushback of this, you know, at a certain class level is one of the things that's quite striking. I'm still working on that element, so I'm probably going to find it next week. But that is where I see things most clearly. The talk that I will give on December 14th or 15th will focus on a legal case in the Japanese Supreme Judiciature, so the Supreme Court of Japan. And it's a case that is very well known that my colleague Okamoto Takuji has written about and others. It's the first case of electricity theft. But the analysis, it's actually taught, it has been taught continually almost at Tokyo Imperial University's law department, which is a kind of epicenter of power in Japan. Of course, it's a feeder into the bureaucracy as a crucial case. So it's very famous. But what I think it shows is something we haven't identified so far, and that is the cinching of a relationship, a political economic relationship between the state zaibatsu interests, so vertically integrated corporations, and energy production. It forecloses the possibility of a more equitable, egalitarian approach of the sort that Tanaka correctly advocated for. So it's not either or, but the dominant narrative, the dominant culture that I see emerging is one that where the Tanakas of the world become more and more marginal and the grid becomes natural, which is, I think, a big dumb argument. So it's not so brilliant, but it's nonetheless important. It becomes so normalized as to be broadly accepted. You asked that question about what I do with our students. I ask them to find out where the electricity and the lights in the lecture hall comes from, right? And so we don't even think in those terms, as Richard White and others remind us eloquently. I hope that answers your question, that it's not meant to be either or, it's both and, it's just adding the and.
Just going to quickly follow up on this, and just for full disclosure, Cyrian's work is actually not on Tanaka Shozo. It is on Ashio and a political establishment that it kind of moved. So I think your work has decentered Tanaka by talking about Ashio from a very different point of view. So you should not feel concerned by this. But I just want to answer the same question a little bit differently, in a sense that I mean, one of the things that the elephant in the room for me in the Ashio context is that it glorifies not just, or it puts a lot of light on the struggle and the conflict and the drama. What it doesn't say, and it's ultimately a spectacular failure. You put that kind of struggle on a pedestal. You put failure as the destination of any environmental struggle. I don't think that we need to do that. Because yes, it made headlines. Yes, it was eminently writable. But it was one of many environmental struggles that were happening at the same time, and many of those that were far more successful in terms of their impact, in their capacity to actually stop stuff from happening, was actually much, much bigger of the things that go under the radar. So for me, there is a question of what it means to struggle. Do you have to die in a struggle for a struggle to be useful? Or at least writable in environmental history? Is that what we mean by struggle? Is that what we want to put out front? Or do we want to talk about environmental justice? Right? And do we want to talk about impact? So what I want to know is, what is the impact of ASIO on subsequent legislature, on subsequent mobilizations? That's what we haven't talked about, and that's what very little ASIO research talks about, right? And that is the key question. The question is not necessarily whether it was a good fight. The question is what came out of that fight and whether it was worth fighting. And that is actually the questions that we're not necessarily asking about. So broadening our definition of what a conflict is, broadening our definition of what a fight is. How does a fighter for environmental justice look like? Is not always a guy with a beard. I mean, no pun intended, sorry. So that's one way of starting to think about it, where I come from.
I had a question for Aleksandra. Sorry, because I swear it's not to defend progress as expansion, but I wanted to ask you about the end of your salt producer stories, how it's ending, because I'm just thinking there is some anachronism in this question, but I was thinking that nowadays, since the 2010s, some producers of food in the Seto, starting from the Seto Inland Sea, have the same questions about staying, not decreasing, but staying small, and how to calculate and to stay small and to have a sustainable, economically sustainable business. So I was just, and of course it's industries that use salt and they cannot find any salt in the Seto Inland Sea. So I was just, I found it amusing, and I wanted to know, how did your story end?
We have exhausted the mics. That tells you something about the quality of this conference. Well, how did it end? I stopped following them in 1905 when the Meiji government takes over their model and calls it the monopoly. And basically some of the mechanisms are the same. It's just that the person who is doing the coordination is no longer doing coordination, it's doing arbitrage at the top, and it's basically distributing quotas. So that's where I stopped following. But by the fact that some of my actors, I say this lovingly, some of my actors are still around, and these were in early 19th century, so they have weathered Tokugawa Meiji transition very well, and we are often told that small people didn't go well through the Meiji transition, right? That's what we were taught. Well, turns out salt guys may be an exception, but there's a remarkable continuity of actors. And there's also something that I'm exploring furthermore, is something, there's a remarkable similarity, and this is completely on the burner right now for my research, is that there is a similarity in the kinds of communities that were involved in these alliance buildings, and these communities that were subsequently able to fight off Sumitomo refining. So this is salt versus copper. But the toponyms are the same. The modes of organizing in order to get something done, which is alliance building, sitting around the table negotiating without compromise, right? Sitting around the table with certain kinds of things cleared ahead of time. I may be crazy, but I'm seeing a copy-paste model, right, between early 19th and early 20th century in a completely different industry. The only thing that's the same is the place, right? So that may be an answer to what happened to my producers, but I think that they and that's another question of impact, right? They may have written up a list of things to do, and they may have circulated it around so that subsequently other activists have figured out how to do some serious negotiation about the slowdown, because that's what happens in the case of Sumitomo refineries, is that there is an imposed slowdown through environmental activism.
Are there any other questions?
Thank you for the fascinating talks. I have two questions for the last two speakers, actually. The first one for Aleksandra is, I was very interested by this question, more than the economic model, even if I'm interested in it, but more than this strategy to avoid boom and bust. And this is something that actually in economic history we can also find in Europe in a different way through different strategies. For instance, the emergence of the cooperative movement, you know, in many places, in many industries. It's also a way to avoid market crash or a thing like that for some industries. And so in Europe, the levers for these was more like the legal status of companies and also how workers organized within the factories. And I wanted to know if in Japan you also observed such kind of legal levers or workers involved also with manufacturers in themselves. So that was the first question. And then about semantics and the last presentation, thanks a lot. When we talk about semantics, about the environment and the Anthropocene, etc., one question is what would be the good word also to get people engaged with the transition, and what would be the good word to so that people can take action. So do you consider that one of these words that you present to us is more suitable for this kind of implementation for action? Thank you.
The short answer is no, we don't have those kind of legal status things. By the time the Meiji government gets organized with that kind of stuff, the Salt Alliance becomes a state monopoly, right? But we can talk about more about what can be compared. But the legal status doesn't come into it.
Unfortunately, I have no solution, no good answer to your question. But I am interested in these discussions and how they are very important for these guys. I think it's an interesting way in order to see how we deal, or each of us deal with these questions of environmental crisis, and maybe the human sciences more with languages or definitions or
just to speak to the question of nomenclature, naming and language, I was struck by the use of energy transition. And so one of the arguments I've been trying out in talks lately is actually building on a scholar of Japan, Obinata Sumio's work. And Obinata is brilliant. It's a fabulous book, but he argues for not either or, he argues for an energy revolution, something, the nomenclature is kakume. And for my money, that's perhaps more appropriate language than transition. And so I think when we shift from environment and nature to talking about energy, which we often slide back and forth without really being attendant to whether we're talking about energy transitions or we're talking about nature more broadly, the Anthropocene as a stand-in for parts per million in the atmosphere of carbon, of CO2, or the Anthropocene as a stand-in for nitrogen cycle disruption, oceanic acidification, etc. Being very specific can help in that, and one of the things I might propose is that we stop talking about transition and we start naming it accurately, at least in academic spheres, and begin thinking about revolution and what that revolution looks like, because transition isn't working. Maybe France is a little bit ahead. The United States is an outlier at the far end, but climate change and denial in Japan is extremely high. That's really worth noting. Japan is not a kind of universally adopting the language of the Anthropocene and so on. Quite the contrary. Japan is an example of a culture and a society that's been resistant to the argument around climate change in the same ways that my country, unfortunately, has been the flag waver for ridiculous denialism. And so maybe we need to shift our language around transition and see how that works.
Thank you. This has been fantastic. Apologies in advance if I'm a bit incoherent because my jet lag has hit very hard. But I wanted to, the question I was going to ask, I want to connect it to, Ian, what you've just said about language. And I've been hearing a lot lately and around, I guess, sort of government policy in Japan, energy transition, green hydrogen, sort of massive investment that's happening as we speak, and that language is energy transition. And I've heard very senior people say energy transition. So I'm thinking about transition and what ring Kakume has in Japan, and sort of going back to some of Lisa's points around the specificity, and Wolf, your points around the specificity of language. But I guess the question that's been in my mind is around impact, partly because Aleksandra, I think you mentioned the word. And I think some of the questions around environmental humanities, what do we call this? One of the questions that's been in my mind has been around the impact of historians and the impact of this work in relation to, say, the fact that the Japanese government is now very, very interested in energy transitions. So I guess it's also connecting, Ian, you were talking about sort of in teaching, and thinking about where are your students going and a sort of midterm or long-term impact that history can have. But I guess I'm wondering, with your work, so I'm bringing a lot together, but Lisa was talking about sort of the bio-renaissance and the ways that history can, I think, then, sort of feed back into those discourses and complicate and nuance and decenter and recenter and provincialize and, Europe and so on. But I guess, sorry, to try and sum up, I guess, what are your thoughts around connecting the research you're doing with whether it's political decision-making or economic decision-making now, and where do you see those connections sitting?
Oh, okay, I'm happy to. That for me is the question. So I was trained as a cultural historian. I wrote a first book about a zoo, of all things. My advisor said, well, they're going to laugh at you if you, thank you for noting that in 2013, publishing a book about animals in Japan studies was weird. One person had done it, and he was on my dissertation committee, Brett Walker. I remember being at a zemi with a very prominent economic historian in Japan, and I told him what I was studying, and he just stopped and said, what are you studying? And things have changed quite a bit. Now Lisa is not just talking about animals, but giving us a much more refined, along with the special issue, much more refined engagement. That book transformed halfway into an environmental history. Because I realized the imperatives at play. And I think, for me, this is the question for all of us, is that question of impact. It's a cliche to say the world is burning, but in fact, the world is burning. And as much as I love Shakespeare and recently attended a wonderful play, I want my son to inhabit a verdant, sustainable planet. And so for me, teaching is the first answer. Our impact with students is immediate. It's not a one-to-one relationship. They don't believe everything I tell them. They're not going to remember everything I tell them. But in terms of impact, there is no question that the classroom for me, because I will never write a best-selling book, is the best first use. Secondarily, luckily, we have a graduate program at my institution, and our students so far are finding work because they write on things like Ashio. They write on rivers. And there is an audience in the academy for folks who are trained in STS and have these skills. So Japan studies in the US, we're finding fewer jobs, but we're finding employability for our students if they engage with this question or related questions. So it's a shift in the political economy of the academy that I think is quite interesting. Area studies is crucial and important, but is shifting and playing a different sort of role. The third point is very nationally specific. It's hard in the United States for an academic to find a broad audience. But when we do, and I don't know how things work here. I mean, I have idealistic notions of intellectuals in France. When we do, I think we need to be, when we see those opportunities, we need to train our graduate students to capitalize on them immediately. So I've only published one piece in the New York Times, but I know it was read by several million people. And the impact of that very short 1,000-word piece, it outweighs all of my monographs. And so I think thinking about writing for different audiences is one way to get there. I also think about Aleksandra's work and rendering data is, I can't speak to it with authority, but I just wanted to gesture to that particular approach. How do we make data that is available to those in the harder social sciences in order to bridge between the humanities and the social sciences? What are the techniques we need to do? What do we lose when we engage in these practices is something to consider as well. I hope that's an answer. I too am jet lagged, and so I'm a little punchy.
Okay, impact. It depends on what you mean by impact, really. But I think that the fact that governments talk about energy transition doesn't mean that we should let them. And I would definitely say let's talk about let's name the thing with a little bit more transition. And one doesn't exclude the other. In other words, I have written an entire grant proposal talking about innovation and game changing, and then proceeded to explain that that's actually not how it works. And so use the word, make it better, and render it toxic and unusable in the old sense. So in other words, I'm not always sure that that forging a new word is a better way ahead. I am maybe old-fashioned, but I'm like, it's not the word that's the problem. It's what's behind the word that bothers me. So I'm going to work on what's behind the word. And if there is another word that needs to be made, then we'll make it. I'm not opposed to it. But what I'm saying is, if there is a word that sounds good, then let's work with that word to make it more precise. Right? And that is perhaps a way of making impact happen. I don't know. But I will also remind Ian that we have spent many, many hours being locked in a room by Carol Gluck and made to write an op-ed for the New York Times of 800 words in under an hour and a half. And I thought, we're recording this, so I thought that was a very interesting way of approaching. I wondered whether it was legal to lock your students up and make them do that. And I thought I was never going to need this. I thought this was some American, some American fantasy. I was fresh off the boat from Serbia. And so I didn't really think that matters. And now I realize how visionary Carol was to make us put the China-Japan textbook controversy in under 800 words for the New York Times. I was like, New York what? And I think that's a way to go. Now, is it easy? Probably not. Is it a hassle? Absolutely. Is it valued by institutions? Well, Maybe at Harvard, yes, I don't know, but here, it's not exactly how you get evaluated. But then I remember my colleague who had trailblazed in that department because he helped write a comic book on a Meiji emperor. And I said, well, if Guillaume Carré can contribute on writing a comic book to the Meiji, then it's probably okay for me to think about writing for impact. I haven't gotten there yet in French or any other language, but I do think that impact is something it's not something you have or don't have, it's something that you make. And there are people who do it better than others, obviously, but it's not something we should complain about not having, but rather opt for making it.
I'd just add one thing. As someone who's an administrator myself, it's something our institutions should facilitate more strongly, and this is something we can advocate for with our administrators. Because folks in the engineering and in the business school and more powerful schools within my university have access to media training that we also have access to, but very few of us take advantage of. And we could begin to, recognize this in promotion, which what gets recognized in promoting to tenure is the definition in the United States of what matters in the academic world. But secondarily, our institutions themselves could facilitate this work perhaps more actively in a virtuous cycle sort of situation, because the more we are heard, the more our names, meaning our institutions' names, are heard, and the higher impact we gain in decision making and so on. So, sounds simple, but it's hard. I also think data. I think there's something to be said about data. There's a digital panel tomorrow of which you're a part, and that's another answer in a certain way, is beginning to reach people through digital media and rendering different sorts of data that become useful for our colleagues in the economics, which is the dominant department in the social sciences where I teach. This is a great pitch for tomorrow's keynote. There we
go. I just want to give an example and answer Jan Miller about how scientists are listened to in France. There was a meeting some weeks ago, I would say, with the CEO of Total Energy. And there was the scientist from the IPCC, a French scientist, Jean Jouzel. And so this scientist, who has been many times in our IPCC report, was of course telling about the burning earth, as you was saying before. And so the CEO listened to him and he said, "Okay, Jean, but I'm in the real world." So this is the way scientists are listened to in our country.
Would you like to answer that?
It's still burning. Yeah, exactly. That's the answer.
Are there any other questions?
Sorry for that. Well, hope is, Chakrabarti on hope is, in terms of language, which was behind the question for you, I think.
I'm an architect and teaching for 35 years in France, having a lot of international relationship and being member of Centre de Recherche sur le Japon Contemporain, the old one, for 10 years in the 80s. Going back to use of words related with environment, what we did suggest to our students is to avoid the word transition when it is attached to environment and introduce the word of rupture, just in order to see what does it mean. Because as a matter of fact, as soon as they will be professional, they will have to face with transition. So better to being at the university or in the architecture school to start thinking about rupture, interruption, you know what I mean? And it works, it works.
I would, if you were not so far and we had a second mic, I would ask you to tell us a bit more about what you mean by it works. What it is that your students get when you say, okay, now don't talk about transition, talk about, or don't work with transition, work with rupture. But as a historian, we have a weird thing with rupture. I mean, as a historian of technology, right? I spend most of my time fighting against the idea that innovation is disruption, right? So if you tell me, let me now figure out a way to turn off lights in this room, so to just give you an idea of what it means to live without electricity, as a way of disrupting your experience for the purpose of showing you that there are other worlds out there today that don't have electricity, and they're not few and far in between. Then sure, okay, let's do a little bit of a rupture / disruption, right? But I think it also has a great risk with it, because then what very often happens is that you have students or scholars who think that just breaking something down makes them innovators, right? Or coming up with something new is obviously going to be better, right? So my issue with rupture is that most of the time, most of our lives, we spend our time trying to maintain life and maintain whatever that needs to happen, right? Maintain bodies, maintain spaces. And we talk far more about rupture then we talk about maintenance of most basic structures. And we also tend to think about groundbreaking as if it were a good thing, right? So my thing with rupture is like, yeah, okay, let's go with it, but for what purpose? And let's not get our eyes off the real thing, which is that rupture may sound better, but we're all here because of maintenance.
And keeping an eye on the bigger picture, it's time for the cocktail. So let's thank our speakers one last time. Thank you all for coming.